Hey guys, it's me, Spencer. I'm going to break a little bit with tradition here and just make an announcement at the beginning that I have something to let you know about at the end of this episode. So stay tuned throughout the whole thing for an important message from me at the end of this episode. There is probably nobody listening to my voice who could not benefit right now from Rocket Money. That's because all of us have to deal with money and finances. It's a fact of life. It's something that we can get very antsy about or moralistic about or scared about, but you don't want to be, caught up in all of that neurosis. You want to have a handle on your finances so that they will not control you. You will control them. That is why you have to check out Rocket Money. For one thing, they will help you to manage and cancel subscriptions you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. They've been doing that for a while, and they used to be called Truebill. So you will maybe have heard me talk about them in that capacity. But now, as Rocket Money, they have grown from a bill management app into a full-on personal finance empowerment tool. They help over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more. They save each of their members on average $700 a year, which if you think about it is a hefty chunk of change. You can start canceling your unused subscriptions, you can save money, and you can do it all at rocketmoney.com/heretics. One more time, it's rocketmoney.com/heretics, formerly known as Truebill. The artist formerly known as Truebill has now expanded and has gotten even better as Rocket Money at rocketmoney.com/heretics. Okay, now let me read to you a tweet about the subject of today's episode. This is from I would say a friend of mine, somebody that I only know through Twitter, and it's a pseudonymous account. So the name is, I guess, not important. But this is somebody who says, I tried for 6 months to read that novel. I had printouts on the characters, the plot points, the themes, but the chapter on the dead priest and his whole backstory killed my motivation. And I'm reading that because I think it's representative of a very common experience with this novel that I'm talking about today, and that is the Brothers Karamazov. This is Dostoevsky's last and greatest novel, Fyodor Dostoevsky's. I think it's his greatest novel. You may disagree. And many people, as you can tell, obviously do. I've been interested, so I've been rereading this novel because I'm going to a conference about it. And when I go to that conference, I'll come back with maybe some more thoughts on it. But I've been rereading it and just deeply moved by it. I read it in high school and sort of, took note of it as a great work of literature, but hadn't really encountered it in any serious way since then. And this time around, it's since I've become a Christian, since I think, read a little bit more and understood the kind of historical context within which Dostoevsky was operating. This time it really struck me. And it's one of those books, it seems, that you either have one of two reactions to. Either it just absolutely breaks your brain, completely blows your mind, and you're really into it, and people love this novel. As I said, it's regarded, pretty widely regarded, I think, as his greatest work. And then there are a lot of people who love to read, people who take care, like this person did, to pay close attention to everything that's going on, and they just can't get into it. I've talked to a lot of folks as I've been reading this novel, people I know to be, highly intelligent, that are capable of reading very advanced texts, who just thought this thing, it destroyed me. I'm sorry. I give up, and it is this big sprawling text. It was published serially, as novels were in this period between the years of 1879 and 1880. It has the quality that Dostoevsky became sort of known for because he was often, wanting cash, because he was in need of, ready money, and because of the nature of serial publication, he felt himself that he was kind of dashing stuff off, like reams and reams of text. And, that intense energy that kind of arose out of necessity. It's often the case, right, that some sort of stylistic or structural necessity gives rise to literary greatness or prompts literary greatness to even greater heights. I mean, this is one of the great mistakes that we have about form and structure and deadlines in our own era, that they're kind of inherently antithetical to art, because you just need to let the creative juices flow and you can't force the muse and so on and so forth. But throughout most of history, this would have struck most artists as nonsense. It's form and art are in an interrelationship. It's true, right? You need to be able to break the rules of the form when when your, true literary genius calls for it. But in order for that breakage to mean anything, you also need constraints, right? And that constraint can be rhythm and meter. It can be, a rhyme scheme in a poem. This creates a certain form of structure within which things can be intelligible. It's also, how language works, right? Many words, most words, I would say, have a kind of arbitrary relationship to the things they denote. So there's nothing in the sound of the word tree, right? Tree, or the way that it looks that inherently kind of connects you to the idea of a tree. And you could make certain arguments that kind of rudimentary words begin in this sort of onomatopoetic way. But by the time you get to advanced languages, by and large, you're not really dealing with pictographs or with, onomatopoetic sounds. You're dealing with a set of conventions, right? Words that don't actually bear any natural direct relationship to the thing that to their reference, the thing that they're denoting. And yet, right, once you agree on the meaning of words, you need to stick to it in order for language to be intelligible. And this is crucial, you need to stick to it in order for changes in language to be intelligible, right? So if we come up with a metaphor, or a simile that is powerful, part of its power is in the fact that it's an unusual use of language. It's not the kind of literal way that we typically use words. And that in itself, right, depends on there being a structure there. So I'm saying all of this to say Dostoevsky himself was frustrated with the constraints of serial publishing. He was frustrated with the financial constraints that he was under throughout most of his life. And yet, right, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like a lot of the challenges that he faced as a writer were also kind of constructive for him as a literary stylist. All of that to say, one of the central features, which is either, incredibly passionately beautiful or maddeningly frustrating about Dostoevsky's work, is that it has this kind of frantic quality to it, which is central to the part of the message that he's getting across. So there's that part of it. There's the issue of Russian names, which we're going to get into in a little bit. And then there is just the, I think, high complexity of what he's conveying. It's a novel with a lot of actual comedy in it, but it also is about, a very sordid murder, right? And some of this stuff, it meanders in all these different ways, and people get frustrated in the way that this Twitter respondent is describing, the way that a lot of people are describing. So I wanted to hopefully, introduce this book to you in a way that could crack it open a little bit. For anybody that has felt like, well, maybe this is a great work, but I don't know how to approach it, or, a lot of the point of this podcast, has always been to kind of get this stuff across to you in a way that you can take ownership of. And so I wanted to start out, before we even really dive into the novel, just hopefully clearing up a little bit of the historical context behind how this thing was written, how to read it, how to deal with the Russian names and all that stuff. So let's just spend some time at the outset getting into that. What are some things that could be helpful to know before you crack the pages, crack the spine of Brothers Karamazov? So, like my father, no relation before me, I do not sleep as much as I should, but one thing that has helped me with that lately is Cozy Earth. It is this awesome company that makes sheets from premium 100% viscose from bamboo, which means they're super soft, lightweight, and temperature regulating. I had never heard of this before either. I bet you haven't. But let me tell you, man, it is a game changer. You will sleep more comfortably year round. It's getting colder, so you're going to want something warm, but you don't want like those weird scratchy sheets. You want something soft and luxurious, and that is what Cozy Earth exists to do. They enhance people's lives with over 5,000 five-star reviews. So they have never wavered on their promise to enhance the quality of people's sleep. Their bedding, towels, and clothing are all warranted against piling, discoloration, and shredding, all of which are problems I have encountered before. I do not have those problems with Cozy Earth, which is great. Whether it's their best-selling luxury sheets, ultra-comfortable loungewear collection, or new bath collection, you will absolutely love shopping at Cozy Earth. You can go to cozyearth.com/heretics to save 35%, which is rockin' deal. cozyearth.com/heretics, HERETICS, just for my listeners. So I mentioned already, right, this book is published between 1879 and 1880 over the course of, about 2 years, a little less than 2 years. and it's published in the Russian Messenger, which went through several kind of iterations as a journal, but eventually became a literary journal as well as a historical journal. And it has this kind of sprawling quality to it. It was clearly, if not, it intended to be his kind of swan song. It did turn out to be his swan song in that he died shortly after he finished publishing it. He, at this point, had been through the life of several men, right? And this is something that he had been kind of detailing and recalling in this thing called the Writer's Diary, which began as a column that he was writing and then became his own kind of publication, where he would regularly kind of reach out to his readers and talk about the state of Russia, and the things that he was reading in the news and the things that his readers were considering, and the effect that his work had had on the world. And so there are a few things from his life that it's maybe helpful to know about as you approach this novel. We did do one episode before on Dostoevsky about his earlier novel, Crime and Punishment. And Crime and Punishment is, I think, much more accessible. People tend to like it a lot more easily because it's a rip-roaring, crime story. It's a psychological thriller. Dostoevsky was interested throughout his life in not just the effects of poverty on the psyche, but on, questions of free will and determinism, and a lot of the issues, and we're going to get into this as we go, a lot of the issues that animated Friedrich Nietzsche a little bit later. Nietzsche was younger, but did encounter Dostoevsky. A lot of these, big questions that are still really very modern questions, right? And he dramatizes them in this incredible thriller, the Crime and Punishment, and so that novel can be, I think, a little bit easier to approach. If you want to go back and listen to the episode we did on that, it might help as well. But let's just kind of go over a few of these major life events, which we talked about there too. Dostoevsky's raised in the house of that is kind of loomed over by this father figure. His dad was an ex-military man. He'd been a military surgeon, and he eventually rose up through the ranks to have land, a property of his own. And a consequence of this is that shortly before the abolition of serfdom in Russia in the 1860s, his dad had serfs, right? And this was this kind of almost feudal system that endured well past the feudal system in the rest of Europe, and it would become an object of Dostoevsky's passionate hatred, the cruelty entailed in economic inequality and the kind of the oppression of the serfs. His dad, who for him was this very imposing, domineering figure, wanted him to go into the military, sent him off to become an engineer. As part of his kind of journey to St. Petersburg to go do that, which was very short-lived, he witnessed, at one point on the street, this kind of central experience. He saw a courier beating a carriage driver, and the carriage driver beating the horse, as if the whole thing were kind of one big machine. And this idea of the way that we transfer our sin onto one another, which he wouldn't have quite put it that way because he hadn't had what would be this kind of central religious episode in his life yet. But it would strongly, I think, kind of nudge him toward what was very popular at the time, which was, socialism, right? Socialism is growing in Russia, especially among the intellectual circles that he'll eventually fall in among. And so he's got this, this dad behind him who dies in 1839. And this is a very important, episode for all of his life, but especially for understanding Brothers K, I think, right? Eventually, the story will develop, and it seems to perhaps have just been a story. But certainly Dostoevsky believed it, that he was murdered. His dad was murdered by his serfs. And so this idea of a kind of uprising, against the domineering father figure on the part of the oppressed poor is, crucial for him throughout. And also crucial, and this is something that Sigmund Freud kind of brought out, I think, in a flawed but interesting essay on Dostoevsky's epilepsy, which he eventually developed. Freud says, it's very, very dangerous when life confirms or satisfies a repressed desire. And the idea here is, and we get this in Brothers Karamazov as well, that there's a certain level at which, Dostoevsky may have been longing for his father to get off of his back, right? He himself and along with his brother Mikhail, they were both kind of these more sensitive artistic types. He hated this idea that he would have to go be a military engineer. And when his father died, right, this was kind of a central psychological episode for him in all sorts of ways. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind as we go in. The other thing to think about is his, sort of early life and his discovery. And we did again talk about this with Crime and Punishment, but it bears kind of revisiting a little bit. I think I'm going to read to you now from the writer's diary for 1877 in January. So this is, again, much, much later in his life. He's looking back at this early period of his youth and how he kind of first achieves literary fame and how he falls in among the circles that will, most influence his early life. So I love the way he begins and describes this. He says, at that time, this was 30 years ago, something happened so characteristic of youth and so fresh and fine, one of those things that remains forever in the hearts of those involved. We were then in our early 20s. I was living in St. Petersburg and had resigned from the Corps of Engineers a year before. So we've now taken him out of his kind of abortive efforts at satisfying his father's ambition and becoming a military man, right? I not knowing myself why, and with only the foggiest and most uncertain goals. It was May of 1845. At the beginning of the winter, having written nothing previously, I had suddenly begun my first tale, Poor People. This is his first novel and the one that kind of makes a big splash. When I had finished, I didn't know what to do with it and where I should try to have it published. I had no contacts in literature at all, save for D.V. Grigorovich, but he himself had not written anything except for one little article, The Organ Grinders of Petersburg, which had appeared in an anthology. As I recall, at the time he was preparing to spend the summer on his country estate and was living for the time being in Nekrasov's apartment. When he stopped by to see me, he said, "Bring me your manuscript." He himself not read it. "Nekrasov wants to publish an anthology next year, and I'll show it to him." I brought the manuscript, saw Nekrasov for a minute, and we shook hands. I was embarrassed at the thought that I had come with my work and left quickly, having said scarcely a word to Nekrasov. I had few thoughts of success and was apprehensive of that fatherland notes party, as people used to call it. So this is, you can see him starting to become involved in a circle of people. Dostoevsky himself, as I mentioned, his father did move up to eventually become landed, right? And to have the kinds of serfs who could resent him enough to kill him, even if that's not actually what happened, right? But he was not nobility. He was not gentry. His mother, who died when he was in his teens, had a little bit more of that kind of upper class elegance to her. But he, as I mentioned, was often hurting for money, and he did not think of himself as having come from the high nobility of Russia. And he's falling in now among a certain kind of elite. And we see this today too, that there's different ways of being kind of in the upper classes of society, right? There's the landed gentry version of being, having a lot of wealth, a lot of inherited wealth, and, being a muckmuck or having, earned a ton of money through business or what have you. And then there is the kind of mystique of the artist, right? And these two things, especially in Petersburg at this time, are sitting in incredible tension with one another. Because on the one hand, as an artist, you become a member of the elite if you're not already. But on the other hand, right, artists especially are incredibly, and critics as well, as we're going to get into in a second, are especially affected by what they understand as this, terrible injustice of serfdom and, economic inequality. And this is part of why sort of socialism is looking attractive at this time, right? And so this is often the way with sort of socialist uprisings, that it comes not out of the so-called proletariat, but out of the, guilt or anxiety or discomfort with, among artists who are inherently kind of supposed to be on the periphery of society, supposed to be gadflies, supposed to be independent, right? It comes along with the anxiety that you get when you start to make it in those circles and become a bit of a muckamuck, and maybe even rich people take an interest in you, right? And all of these things, incredibly subtle and difficult class relationship, right, between the upper classes, the proper aristocracy in any society. And I say that proper, not in the sense of, that they're necessarily actually the best, but just like the real, landed interests, the money, the guys with all the cash. And then the people who kind of fancy themselves, or indeed are sort of outsiders, but nevertheless are, in the periphery of that class. It's a very kind of complex thing. And you can see why in these circles, right, this great passion for the uprising of the people, right, might become a thing. And I think you can see this in the rest of what he's describing. He says, I had been reading Belinsky with great interest. This is Vissarion Belinsky, who's going to be his first kind of literary mentor and sort of leader, the guy that incorporates him into high literary society. Right? I've been reading Belinsky with great interest for some years, but he seemed to me to be somewhat awesome and terrible. He'll make fun of my poor people, was the thought that sometimes came to me, but only sometimes. I wrote the work with passion, almost with tears. Can it be that all these moments I lived through with pen in hand while writing this story, can it be that all this is a lie, a mirage, a counterfeit emotion? But such thoughts, of course, came only in moments, and my sense of apprehension would quickly return. And if you've ever written something, you know exactly what feeling Dostoevsky is describing here, right? I mentioned that episode with the beatings being passed along from the from the courier to the driver to the horse. These passionate moments of emotional engagement that he's now translating into the page, right? Can it be that all this is a lie, a counterfeit emotion? But what will people think, right? I had handed over the manuscript. On the same day, the evening of the same day I had handed over the manuscript, I went off to visit an old friend who lived some distance away. We spent the whole night talking about dead souls and reading the work. I can't remember how many times we had read it before. This is what young people did in those days. 2 or 3 would get together. Why don't we read Gogol, gentlemen? Gogol was a major influence in the young Dostoevsky. Why don't we read Gogol, gentlemen? And we would sit down and read perhaps all through the night. Many of the young people of the day seemed to be filled with a spirit of some sort and seemed to be awaiting something. When I came home, it was already 4 o'clock on a Petersburg white night, as bright as day. The weather was fine and warm. And when I came into my apartment, I did not go to bed, but opened the window and sat by it. Suddenly the bell rang, giving me a great start, and then Grigorovich and Nekrasov, in utter rapture, and both almost in tears, burst in to embrace me. They had come home early the evening before, taken up my manuscript and begun to read it to see what it was like. We'll be able to tell from the first 10 pages. But then, when they had read 10 pages, they had decided to read 10 more. And then without putting it down, they sat up the whole night reading it aloud, taking turns as one grew tired. And so this novel obviously has this tremendous emotional power. Belinsky himself, also, when it's passed on to him, has the same reaction. And Dostoevsky is in, right? This is kind of what gets him into these sort of socialist and literary circles of the day in St. Petersburg. From Belinsky's circle, he will then pass on to what's called the Petrushevsky circle, a different but similar kind of group of utopian dreamers, right? And it's in that context that he has the experience which will end up transforming the course of his career, and without which I don't think we can really understand the relationship why it is that he did not end up as a socialist academic for the whole of his life, and what his relationship was, and why he could see from the outside all of the ways that socialism and materialism and scientism, right, all these things that we've been talking about, all these isms, right, which we still live with, that he could see, as I think nobody else could, the ways that they would go terribly wrong. So last week I announced that I will stop making new Young Heretics episodes at the end of this year. And one thing I neglected to mention is how wonderful it has been to work with the folks at Soundfront. They are so talented and gifted, and I understand that many of them were hired through Indeed. Indeed is a hiring platform that helps you to take the time off your hands that you would otherwise spend running your business. You don't want to spend that time rifling through a million different resumes when all you really need is the top-notch candidates. Indeed is the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. One-stop shop, saves you time, and it is the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. It's a really nice deal. With Instant Match, as soon as you sponsor a post, you get a short list of quality candidates with resumes on Indeed that match your job description. That is the thing that's going to be a killer for you. Otherwise, if you're not using Indeed, you're going to be just putting out these calls for applications, and the hiring market is so crazy. You'll get all sorts of stuff that you really, is going to be a waste of your time. Indeed fixes that. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/heretics. That's a $75 credit at Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So again, this is an episode that we covered in the Crime and Punishment episode, but they're in the Dostoevsky circle. The secret police basically perform a crackdown. They're worried about revolutionary activity, and the Dostoevsky circle is, reading aloud works that are considered kind of dangerous to the state. And Dostoevsky, among with several others, is condemned to death by firing squad under the Tsar. And there are groups of three, right, in which they're going to be killed. Dostoevsky is the third in the second group. So he's got, he's watching one group ahead of him. And then he describes in this famous letter exactly what happens. And it's in the introduction to this edition that I'll be using of the Brothers Karamazov. So let me read to you from that now. And let me just mention that this is the Richard Pevere and Larissa Volokonsky translation. I think I read from the Katz translation of Crime and Punishment, and this Pevere and Volokonsky edition has been really, I think, received with great fanfare, in part because it captures some of the disorder of the novel that I was talking about, right? It captures, I have no way, not being a Russian speaker myself, I have no way of judging the fidelity of any translation to a Russian text personally, but I read in evaluations and reviews of this translation that one of the things it does, right, is it doesn't smooth out the jagged edges of Dostoevsky's writing. And counterintuitively, that actually helps, I think. It makes it easier to grip onto because you get the distinctive flavor of just how rough and ready this work is. And Dostoevsky himself was famous for comparing himself with, Tolstoy, for instance, and saying, well, these guys didn't really know the gritty, poor circles among which I had really moved and that I had experienced things. And so he has this regard for himself as kind of more of a rough and ready writer. And they really get that beautifully. But here from the introduction is this letter that he writes to his brother. I mentioned his brother Mikhail, with whom he was sent to school for engineering and who shared some of his literary tastes, right? Today, December 22nd, we were driven to Semyonovsky parade ground. There, the death sentence was read to us all. We were given the cross to kiss, swords were broken over our heads, and our final toilet was arranged, white shirts. Then 3 of us were set against the posts so as to carry out the execution. We were summoned in threes. Consequently, I was in the second group, and there was not more than a minute left to live. I remembered you, my brother, and all yours. At the last minute, you alone were in my mind, and it was only then that I realized how much I love you, my dearest brother. I also succeeded in embracing Pleshiev and Durov, who were beside me, and bade farewell to them. Finally, the retreat was sounded. Those who had been tied to the posts were led back, and they read to us that His Imperial Majesty granted us our lives. This is Nikolai I, who was the father of Alexander II, who would free the serfs, right? So this is before the freeing of the serfs, 1849. And we're dealing with the father of the emperor who will eventually free the serfs, but this is kind of this gesture, right, of magnanimity on his part, right? Thereupon followed the actual sentence, which was going to be penal servitude, right, in Siberia, and we'll get into that in a second. But he goes on writing to his brother. He says, "Brother, I'm not depressed and haven't lost spirit. Life everywhere is life. Life is in ourselves and not in the external. There will be people near me, and to be a human being among human beings and remain one forever, no matter what misfortunes befall, not to become depressed and not to falter. This is what life is. Herein lies its task. I have come to recognize this. This idea has entered into my flesh and blood. Yes, it's true. That head which created, lived by the highest life of art, which acknowledged and had come to know the highest demands of the spirit, that head has been cut from my shoulders. Memory remains, and the images I have created and still not molded in flesh. They will leave their harsh mark on me, it is true, but my heart is left me, and the same flesh and blood which likewise can love and suffer and desire and remember, and this is, after all, life. On voit le soleil. This is a French phrase meaning we see the sun. On voit le soleil. Well, goodbye, brother. Do not grieve for me. Never until now have such rich and healthy stores of spiritual life throbbed in me. This image, which I did not read last time from this letter, of having your head cut off, but your heart remains, crucially important for the way that Dostoevsky would portray his own characters. And here I have to make reference to a podcast, not by me, but by my friend Daryl Cooper, who runs the Martyr Made podcast. And a lot of his podcasts are behind a paywall. A lot of his content, you have to sign up to his Substack for, which I recommend you do, by the way. Very, very worthwhile. But this one you can get for free. It's called The Underground Spirit. And this is, it's a beautiful exposition, a long exposition of something we will talk about in a bit, which is the relationship between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. And that relationship is in some ways, going to be the subject of my first approach to this novel. We're going to make a couple different approaches to the themes in Brothers K when we get to it. But one of the things that Daryl says in that podcast that I think is really beautiful is he explores the idea of the divided self, right? The divided conscience. And we have talked before about the conscience as what the Greeks would have called a suneidesis, and which comes into Latin as conscius, right? Knowing alongside, right? And this idea that you have within yourself something that can see yourself goes right back to Aristotle, who says, we see things with our eyes, but we also perceive that we see, right? We're self-aware in this way. And that consciousness either goes on back into infinity, right? It's either an infinite regress, or there is something that both knows and knows that it is knowing, right? And this is self-awareness. This is suneidesis. This is consciousness. And that's why consciousness and conscience are so close together. Of course, there's also a diseased version of this, and that's what Daryl is talking about in his show, is that, for Dostoevsky and indeed for Nietzsche, and this is something that, of course, Freud also gets into in some detail, right? That sense of being divided or split against oneself was terribly painful, and could spiral into a crippling kind of self-awareness or self-criticism or indeed anguish, right? And it's interesting to watch how Nietzsche translated this into a form of philosophy and eventually into madness, right? Because Nietzsche would discover Dostoevsky not long before he went mad, which, again, we will talk about later on down the line. But Dostoevsky translated this, I think, in many ways productively into his literature, into his writing. And so in Brothers Karamazov, one thing to understand, and one reason why I'm spending so much time on Dostoevsky's, feelings about his father and about his literary life and the kind of internal conflicts that he's dealing with. Did I actually want my father to die, right? In the way that sort of Freud suggests. Did I in fact want to be a part of the upper crust, or did I, want to be a man of the people, right? These internal tensions are beautifully kind of brought to light in the various characters, the various brothers of Brothers K, right? I mean, it's too reductive to say that each one of them represents some part of him. But it's certainly true that each brother has something to say, about, has magnified some part of what Dostoevsky feels about his father and his life and what he's sort of seen in the state of Russia. And so this notion of the head and the heart, right, the battle between him of the head and on the heart, which really is embodied in the novel in the relationship between Ivan and Alyosha or Alexei, right? These two brothers who kind of make the core of the novel. There are two other brothers, one legitimate, one illegitimate. There's Dmitri, and then there's Smerdyakov. But these two, Ivan and Alyosha, at least when it comes to the head and the heart that we were just talking about, right? They kind of represent this battle that was raging in him, but also in his circles, and he, I think, saw in Russia, right? The idea that actually, if you have these grand notions, this sort of highly, super sophisticated intelligence, you can reason your way into any kind of utopia and out of the things that the heart knows. And it's the heart, right, which discerns and perceives the moral realities, which make things like utopianism and socialism actually impossible, right? That the things that, if you cut the mind off from the heart, it will create something that looks like utopia, but is actually a nightmare. And the only way to know that it's a nightmare is to reassert the primacy of those heart truths, right? Of the moral universe. And we talked about that a little bit too in Raskolnikov, whose name, by the way, Daryl points out, right, is a pun on the word for division, right? So this idea is obviously alive in Dostoevsky's mind as well, that Russia is in a battle, he is in a battle, and in some ways the modern West is in a battle between the head and the heart that need to find some form of reconciliation. If there's going to be salvation of the Western soul, there needs to be a reconciliation between the Western mind and the Western heart. And for Dostoevsky, it has to be the heart that takes the lead, because the heart has been kind of denied and talked down to and dismissed as sort of secondary or unimportant. And actually what it is it's a conduit for us to the most important truths, the things without which the mind cannot possibly reason. And so that is what he will eventually uncover, among other things, in Siberia, among the criminals, right, among the lowest of the low. And he's, up against really the depths of human privation and sorrow and evil and sin, right? And some of these things, like evil and sin, right, and indeed, guilt, right, the guilt that Ivan will eventually describe as guilt for your own desires rather than your own actions, right, is what you can't wish away in a place like Siberia, right, in a penal colony. And so he encounters characters, that he has a whole kind of novelized version of this, which Pavir and Volokonsky, I think, translated as Notes from a Dead House. It's typically, in older translations, it comes across as the House of the Dead. And this is kind of, I think, what he really was grappling with, and what would eventually lead him to a troubled and self-critical, but also profound and enduring Christianity, right? And that is going to be the kind of the Christianity of the heart, right, which weeps over the suffering of a brother, is going to be his irrefutable, I think, answer to not only the kind of Nietzschean proposition, which is the Übermensch, but also to the socialist proposition, right, which is the kind of materialist foundation for all ethics. And he says very early on in the book, his narrator in Brothers Karamazov say the question of socialism is precisely the question of materialism and atheism. And that question, which is really the question of bringing heaven down to earth rather than, letting heaven draw earth up to itself. That is the kind of question of the age and the question that he's wrestling with in all of these different characters. And it's important to remember, right, that many of the most famous scenes from this novel are very eloquent articulations of the atheist materialist point of view. In fact, probably the three biggest scenes, two of which are encounters between Alyosha and Ivan, and one of which is an encounter between Ivan, who is now going mad, and an imagined devil, or is he imagined or not? We don't really know, right? They all involve very eloquent descriptions of, why the world is just, it's just matter, and why evolution explains everything. All the things that Nietzsche himself was coming up against and grappling with. And to me, I really think that what's remarkable about this novel is that Ivan almost is Nietzsche. I mean, he sees what Nietzsche sees. He goes mad in the way and for the reasons that Nietzsche goes mad. And it wasn't this book that Nietzsche encountered when he first found Dostoevsky. It was Notes from Underground, or a compilation called The Underground Spirit that contained Notes from Underground. But the fact that Dostoevsky could see the implications of all these ideas so profoundly that he could create a character like Ivan, who basically, is Nietzsche, and a character like Alyosha, who, along with the dead priest that was mentioned in the early tweet, along with Father Zosima, is the answer to Nietzsche, I think is a really remarkable feat. So we are going to get into that. But before we do, there's one other thing that I have to sort of lay out here, and that is the thorny problem of Russian names. Because anybody that has hurled this novel across the room in frustration has done so, at least in part, because the characters' names keep changing. And this is a famous issue that's not limited to this novel or even to Dostoevsky, but simply to the way that Russian names tend to work and the way that they work in these, especially these kind of 19th century dynastic novels with all these different related people who have some names that are the same and some names that are different, and also all these nicknames and diminutives and so on and so forth. So let me try to clear this up a little bit in case you do go away and read this book, which I hope that you will. One thing that I always really love is when people come up to me. I mean, I obviously love when people say, oh, I listened to your show, whatever. But my favorite thing to hear from you is, I listened to your show and then I went away and I started reading these books, right? And because those are the things that I'm trying to give to you, right? I'm trying to give to you these things in a way that can hit you in the heart. the way they were meant to. And so, when I do any of this kind of like breakdown or dissection, it's mostly so that you don't get frustrated in the way that so many people get frustrated with these kind of technical concerns. And again, not limited to Dostoevsky. In fact, one of the things that from the very beginning of this show has always been a question that people ask me is, how do I fight my way through these incredibly complicated and difficult texts? And there are different answers in different parts of this question, but here one of the things is like, just let's talk a little bit about the technicalities of the name situation. The best way that I have found to keep track of Russian names is not, Pavir and Volokonsky give a very, very helpful, I should say, list of characters at the opening. And that's good. But even then, you don't want to be flipping back to this list of names at the beginning all the time. So the best way that I have found to keep track of these names is to think of them as genuinely conveying information. They are not just kind of, all names convey a certain amount of, family information about a person, but Russian names actually, more than English names, have a systematic way of conveying information about the person that they name. And once you have kind of locked that system into your mind, it becomes much less confusing to find all of these different names used, and actually which name people use at which time, right, is a super helpful piece of information that you're getting in the novel about what the relationship is between the individuals and so forth. And so rather than just passing over them as these kind of complicated strings of letters, right, if you think about this, this is something with actual information for me, how do I decode it? It becomes actually much simpler. So the easiest thing, I think, is to start with the last name. And every Russian character basically has these three different names and then a bunch of variations on those three different names. So the last name is the same, does the same thing that our last names do in English, and that is tells you what family they're a part of. So often they end with Azov or Ezov, and that's the case here, right? Karamazov. So it's easy to talk about this in terms, I think, of the three main brothers, the legitimate brothers, because they will come up most, and also they're in a family. So they help us to see how all of this works. So all of the brothers and the father, who, spoiler alert, is going to die halfway through. This is kind of about the death of a father, this novel. So it's not that big of a spoiler to say that's the premise, right? All of these guys and the father have the last name Karamazov. That will never change, basically. I mean, there's like sort of the only way that gets changed is when they say things like Karamazovian, right? They have this kind of like, there's a certain spirit to the family, but that just tells you what clan these people are a part of. Then you have the first name, right? And the first name is again, sort of self-explanatory in the way that our first names are self-explanatory, although there are all sorts of ways to mess around with them, which we will get into in a second. But so let's say, for example, the father's name is Fyodor Karamazov, right? Dmitry Karamazov is the eldest brother. Middle brother is Ivan or Ivan Karamazov. And then you have Alexei or Alyosha, as we'll get into in a second, Karamazov, right? The middle name is a patronymic, and a patronymic tells you who that person's father is, right? So this indicates where in the generations. The reason this is here, among other things, is to tell you where in the generational hierarchy the people are within the family. So the male patronymic ending is Ovich or Evich, and the female patronymic ending is Ovna or Evna. And so once you take that ending off, right, you've just got the name of the dad. So Fyodor Karamazov has a middle name, which is a patronymic, Pavlovich, which tells you that his dad is named Pavlov. All the other brothers, right, have a middle name, Fyodorovich, right, because their dad is Fyodor Karamazov. So Dmitry Fyodorovich Karamazov, Ivan Fyodorovich Karamazov, Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov, right? And so all of these guys are going to have, all the brothers, everybody on the same like plane of the family tree is going to have the same middle name and the same last name. And then, for instance, you have, Katerina Ivanovna, which tells you that her dad's name is Ivan, right, or Ivan. Then you have these intolerable nicknames, and this is the hardest part, right? They typically begin with either the first letter of the name or some, middle syllable of the name. So, for instance, you get Dmitry, but you also get Mitya. And then you get Alexei, but you more often get Alyosha. And right there, that's the thing to know, right, is that this is where you get relationship information, like personal relationship information. So all the other stuff tells you about the individual, his dad, and his family, right? Or her dad and her family. The nicknames tell you information about the relationship between the people who are talking. And so, for instance, one thing to watch out for is Shenka or Inka, right, which is a diminutive. So you have Alyoshenka, right? Alexei becomes Alyosha, Alyosha becomes Alyoshenka, and that's like my little Alyosha. So you can imagine like somebody almost like pinching his cheek as they say this. And so one thing to ask, right, is why is it that Alexei is almost always called Alyosha, right? And that tells you something about his relationship to people, that he's very beloved, that people feel familiar around him. St. Paul, in the letter to the Romans, uses the Greek word dokimos to describe what a peaceful man is like. And dokimos means sort of something like seemly, like he's just somebody that people get along with. And so that's something that you get out of the use of Alyosha. So 3 pieces of information plus a fourth, right? Who this person is, who his or her dad is, and what family he or she belongs to. And then finally, with the nicknames, what kind of relationship he's in with the person he's talking to. Once you kind of start to break that down and you memorize how that works and how the endings work, these things actually aren't as hard as they initially seem. Okay, now I think we are ready to get into this novel, and we're going to do that starting next week, because for now I have an announcement, as I mentioned at the opening of the show, that we have to get into. Let me tell you about Field of Greens, which has really been upping my diet game lately. And by diet, I do not mean my efforts to starve myself, because that's not what you ought to be doing. You ought to be getting the essential nutrients that you need, however you find best to get them. I'm a big fan of healthy eating, but I'm not a fan of fad diets or crazy supplements, and that is why Field of Greens is awesome. It's packed with a full spectrum of essential vegetables and fruits, plus science-backed herbs and prebiotics, which is what you need to stay healthy. It also works really quickly. You will start to see great results, more energy. You'll look and feel healthier. It can help you lose weight if that's what you're trying to do, if you have a goal weight you're trying to get to. It's really just top-notch all around, and not one of these kind of bizarre supplements that you don't quite know, like whether it's going to give you some sort of weird renal failure in the next 10 years or something. I'm making that up. But Field of Greens you can trust. Join me to take Field of Greens as well. To help you get started, I got you 15% off your first order and another 10% when you subscribe for recurring orders. That's fieldofgreens.com when you use the promo code Heretics. Fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics. Okay, folks, so we're putting Dostoevsky and the Brothers Karamazov aside for a second, because there's something that I need to let you know about. And that is that at the end of this year, I am going to stop producing new episodes of Young Heretics. And instead, I'm going to be producing content with Daily Wire Plus. And so this is, to me, an extremely exciting thing, but it also is something that I wanted to give you time for us to talk about, because this show has meant a lot to me. I hope it has been, helpful and valuable in your life too. And even though this is not the end, even though I'm going to keep doing content on the exact same stuff on the great works of the West with the Daily Wire, I did just want to take a moment and thank you from the bottom of my heart for the journey that we have taken together. It's not totally over. We're going to keep adding new episodes every week to this feed through the end of 2022. And then in 2023, Daily Wire content featuring your pal Spencer Klavan about the great works of the West is going to come into being. And it's going to be on Daily Wire Plus. So you will be able to find me there. And I hope to continue the journey with you there. This is something that I have heard a lot of people ask me. When Daily Wire Plus became a thing, a lot of people did say, like, when are you going on to Daily Wire Plus? And so it probably isn't going to be a huge shock to a lot of you. And like I say, I'm really stoked about what we're going to make. I think it's going to be, just this, everything that you have loved. If you have loved anything about this work that we've been doing together, you're going to keep loving and then some in this next stage. But look, I mean, when we first started making Young Heretics, I actually was remembering that we got a knock on the door from the cops at one point because we weren't supposed to be gathering with so many people because it was COVID. And so that tells you a little bit about the time that has passed, the seismic changes that have occurred within American life since we've been doing this show, and the changes that I have known in my own life, right? Since the way that I've grown in, meeting you guys and hearing from you about, your relationship with this content, with the great works of the West, which have meant so much to me and have transformed my life in so many ways. And like I said earlier, when I hear from you guys that, because of something I said that helped you get into it, like these works have also transformed your life, then I really do just feel, like I'm serving whatever purpose I was put on this earth for. And so I wanted to thank you for that. And I wanted to encourage you, please, to come along with me into the next step. There's going to be a little pause. And then in 2023, kind of along with my book, How to Save the West, when that comes out in February, we're going to have more stuff also over at Daily Wire Plus. If you are on Locals and you have a yearly membership that still has time left, we'll connect with you in another context about like what to do with that. So we can kind of reach out together and discuss there about that. If you're on a monthly membership, that can just, that will just end along with the new episodes of Young Heretics. And just generally, I wanted to read to you a little bit actually from this thing that Dostoevsky wrote. And it seems really appropriate that we're talking about Brothers Karamazov. I didn't know this when I started to prepare for these episodes. But right before he started, really publishing Brothers K, he had been, I think, gestating it and working on it before this. But right before he went off to really, make the thing, in that writer's diary that I was telling you about, which he had been going on for quite some time, he let his readers know that he was also taking a hiatus and going to go on and do something else, that they would continue the journey in a new way. And so I wanted to read to you from what he had said to his writers, because I co-sign a lot of what he writes here. So this is from the December 1877 edition. So right before he's about to go, he says he's been gestating it, and he's about to go, really make his last great work. And hopefully the Daily Wire Plus stuff won't be my last great work, but it's a similar situation. Here's what he writes. He says, "The December and final issue of the diary appears after such a delay for two reasons. Because of my very poor health throughout the whole month of December." Remember, he had health problems. He was an epileptic, right? "As a result of the unforeseen move to a different printer after the former one closed down its business, there were inevitable delays in this new unfamiliar place. In any case, I assume the responsibility and beg the indulgence of my readers. To the many questions of my subscribers and readers as to whether I might publish issues of the diary from time to time next year without restricting myself to monthly publication, I hasten to reply that I find this impossible for many reasons." And this is where he really gets into something that I would like to say to you as well. He said, "I've been putting out my little periodical for myself as much as for others. After all, from a compelling need to express myself in our curious and most peculiar age. A year from now, there may ensue a time that may be even more exciting and more distinctive, and then we shall serve the good cause together once more. I write together because I plainly regard my many correspondents as my co-workers. Their letters, remarks, advice, and the sincerity with which they all treated me have helped me a good deal. How I regret that I was unable to reply to so many of them, owing to a lack of time. I ask the kind, good-hearted indulgence of all those to whom I have still not replied." Man, this really is, it's uncanny actually how much this expresses what I would like to express to you as well. "I was unable to answer the questions of many correspondents because such important and vital issues as now absorb them cannot be answered in letters. To do this, one must write articles or even whole books, but not letters. A letter cannot help but leave out some things and lead to a certain confusion. There are some issues that are certainly not matters for correspondence. Once more, my thanks to you all. I hope we may look forward to a happy meeting in the near future. We now live in a glorious but difficult and critical time. How much now hangs by a thread at this very moment, and somehow we shall manage to speak about it all a year from now." Well, my friends, when Dostoevsky says that he regards his readers and his writers of letters as collaborators, I could not agree with him more. When I hear from you, when you write me questions, when you write me stories about your own life, when you are brave and generous enough to share with me your experiences of COVID struggles and speaking up in class and worrying about your personal lives. I mean, I cherish these things and I consider them so precious, and I think of them as urgent and urgently connected to the vast questions that we are dealing with as a society, as the West and as America. That's why I wrote my book, which I hope you will check out, How to Save the West. And it's why I'm moving on into this new Daily Wire Plus situation. It's why, as when Dostoevsky says, I want, to respond to you in a bigger way, that's what I'm doing. I want to give you something still more at Daily Wire Plus, and I'm excited about doing that. I'm so grateful to you for sharing everything that you have shared with me so far. And I look forward to a happy meeting in the near future, as Dostoevsky says. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. I look forward to continuing these weekly episodes through the end of the year. And I hope you will join me on the next stage of the journey. Let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals. And that has been, when I talk about, how wonderful it has been to get to know listeners of this show who love these works and who incorporate them into their lives, I want to give a special thanks and shout out to my VIPs over on Locals. Like I said, we will talk more if you've got a year-long subscription about what will happen there. But for now, I get these all on Locals, and we do weekly live streams as well. Here's a question from Garrett. I've been reading the Brothers Grimm fairy tales in their original form to my daughter at night, and they on occasion have striking and archaic situations in the story. They remind me of some of the stories of ancient Greek mythology we've been talking about, and stories from the Old Testament too. It's really baffling to me that this is present in much newer stories by comparison. Do you have any commentary on this? Yeah, I think, and I should say that, when we're talking about Greek myths, we're really talking about the core of what I've always loved to talk and think about. And obviously the Old Testament as well is something that is very near and dear to me. Brothers Grimm, I've read, but I have not had, as intimate contact with the history of that work. But one thing I do know about it is that it was being collected and gathered together. The Brothers Grimm were doing their collection around about the same time that we've been discussing, the sort of changes that are taking place in Russia, the social and class changes, and also the kind of yearning for unification that was coming along with these new changes. Because as you start to break down the kind of old strata of society, which have really become outdated as a result of capitalism, as a result of some of the new ideas that have come about through America, right, and the changes that are happening in England, and also to a certain extent the French Revolution, right. There's this yearning for brotherhood, right? The brotherhood of man, or the brotherhood of Russians, or the brotherhood of Germans, right? And this has become kind of maligned because it was so terribly wielded under these awful, regimes that we know of from the 20th century. But as an impulse, of course, it's quite noble to want to find some common thread that binds us together. And the ancient answer to that question is of what binds us together. In part, one of the ancient answers is stories, right? Now, of course, again, a phrase that gets maligned a lot and misused a lot is blood and soil, right? But those are also things that bind people together, right? Sharing a place, sharing genetic relationships, all of those things have, historically and still are important, right? But they're not enough, as Aristotle points out, actually. They're not enough to make a polis or to make a nation. You need some sort of politeia, and the politeia, which is the, small c constitution, is not just the laws. It's also the kind of cultural reference points and the intermarriages and the shared ceremonies and telling stories, even if those stories are not necessarily, even if the people who are telling them know that there are elements of legend or fiction in them. I've argued again and again throughout the lifespan of this show, what an emotional power stories have to convey things that you can't convey any other way, to get across things that can't be directly conveyed in language. And so I suspect that one reason why the Brothers Grimm are giving you stuff that has that kind of earthy power of the past in it is not just because they were collecting old folktales, but also because they're doing something kind of similar to what the Greeks were doing, at least during the classical period, when they were adopting certain myths and certain heroes as their national figures, or their national is an anachronistic term to use there, but they're political figures, right? And so I think that this is something conservatives are famously slow to reckon with or to deal with, but that's crucially important, for any sort of real patriotic symbiotic approach to life, right, is you can't just have the laws that bind you together. You can't just have blood. You can't just have soil. You also need stories, right? And I think that that's really why there's so much similarity in all three things that you're describing, regardless of their time period, have that same social function, and it's crucially important. All right, folks, that's it from me. I will see you next week. As always, although not for much longer, if you like this work, you will love the Claremont Institute, which is not going anywhere. You can find them at claremont.org, and you can help support us by going to claremont.org/donate and mention in the notes that you heard about it through Young Heretics, if you would. Thanks, as always, folks. I am excited for this journey to continue. I'm excited for the next journey to begin, and I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.